University of Florida's research strength to address some of the world's most formidable challenges, create unprecedented access to AI training and tools that will help build momentum in the research teaching front. Specifically, there'll be a specific focus on new faculty hires across campus, bringing in specialization in artificial intelligence that will really help shift our profile. In fact, this was a $70 million AI partnership that brought together private donation as well as industry donation. So with this in mind, again, in the panel coming up in our subsequent discussion, we're going to hear from 4 faculty in our college: Ian Flood, Zhong-Ren Peng, Ravi Srinivasan, and Tim Murtha, who are each working with their research teams to turn AI to advance the knowledge base. Doing research on everything from building performance to patterns of resiliency to better chart the course for a vibrant and sustainable future. So I want to introduce you to Ian Flood, Zhong-Ren Peng, Ravi Srinivasan, and Tim Murtha, who will present their work in turn. And then we will have your questions and your comments to cap off this session. Okay, Dr. Flood.
Okay, good. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you just fine.
Okay, so will somebody start my PowerPoint presentation? All right, I have it on my machine. I could run it on my machine and share it. Okay, and is it possible for me to have control of the PowerPoint?
Yes, we've given you control.
Okay, thank you.
All you have to do is click the screen.
Okay. All right, thank you. So what I wanted to use this time to do was really just to place some context to where is artificial intelligence and where is it going, and just sort of broadly talk about my research and where it fits within that framework. So it's not, oh, okay, I guess there's a lag. All right, so first of all, I want to give a brief history of artificial intelligence. So the way I see it, and I think most people see it, is that artificial intelligence can be broken down into boxes like machine learning, symbolic manipulation, other things. Machine learning is where I think most interest is currently, and that can be divided into neural networks, support vector machines, and many other categories. Then neural networks, which again is where most of the interest in machine learning currently exists, can be divided into shallow neural networks and deep neural networks. The difference really is just in the number of hidden layers that you have inside the neural network structure. Now, historically, in 1950, Alan Turing predicted that by around 2000, human intelligence would be sort of indistinguishable from artificial intelligence, or the other way around, if you like. I don't think we're quite there yet, but certainly there are artificial intelligence applications that outsmart people. First neural network was developed in 1958. In 1986, backpropagation was popularized, and that really made it possible to develop some fairly meaningful shallow neural networks. But it didn't work very well for deep neural networks. In 1992, a nonlinear version of support vector machines was developed, and these really outperformed shallow neural networks. And so neural networks they sort of lost their popularity for some period of time. But between the 1980s and today, there have been incremental improvements in learning techniques in particular, which have meant that backpropagation and other techniques can really now be used to develop very powerful, deep neural networks. And I would say that more often than not, these are outperforming other techniques. And so this is really the state of the art, deep neural networks. Okay, so the system is just lagging a little bit, so just bear with me. On this slide, going along with the theme of saying, you know, how far have we gotten? What I'm showing here is the complexities of different types of computational device. So this first column here is for biological brains, okay? And this is a logarithmic scale measuring how many primary processing units there are making up each brain. So a nematode has something like 300 neurons. If you come up to a rabbit, it's like 1 billion. For humans, it's about 100 billion. Now, if you compare progress in complexity for digital computers, we have, well, the first stored memory computer in 1947 had about 2,000 switches. So a switch, today it's sort of the same thing as a transistor. I know it's not the same thing as a neuron, but you know, these are the basic building blocks. By 2011, we had processors with 2.6 billion transistors in them. And it's projected that, you know, very soon we'll have integrated circuits with as many transistors as there are, say, neurons in the human brain. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to be as powerful as the human brain, but it shows the progress. Okay, now, oh, sorry, the system's lagging. Well, the last thing I had wanted to show on that slide was advances in artificial neural networks. And it was really about halfway up that list. The most advanced neural networks of today have something in the order of maybe a few million neurons in them. And if you go back to the 1980s, when we were developing shallow neural networks, we were really just talking about tens of neurons in a neural network. So we've made some real progress, but you know, it's not just about the number of neurons, it's also about the complexity of the structure. Now, in this slide, I just wanted to make the point that, you know, a lot of people think, you know, get excited about machine learning because they think all you need to do is get some data, put it in a, say, a neural network frame, switch on a training algorithm, and out comes your model. So a bit like making Instant Pot noodles. In reality, it's nothing like that, okay? In reality, most of the intelligence in a neural network actually comes from the person building it. I have here on the right a list of tasks that a person must perform to develop a machine learning solution, maybe a neural network. And these require expertise in science And I say art because there is an art to neural networks and machine learning too. So it's mainly human intelligence still that's going into these things. Okay, the system is lagging. But what I want to do next, I have some examples of applications that I've been developing with my students over the years. I just want to jump to the last one because I understand I only have 10 minutes to talk. But it illustrates a few points. We're almost there. Okay. So this came out of some research that I was performing, I don't know, maybe about 15 or 20 years ago for the Air Force Research Laboratory. We developed a neural network which would predict the strength of a blast on a building based on parameters such as the size of the bomb, the distance to a barrier, the height of that barrier, the distance to the building. Training was, we used supervised training with data generated from simulation models. Now, here we go. The advantage of that was, one of the advantages anyway, was that it was very fast. So the simulation model might take days on a supercomputer to complete a single run. The neural network could do it in a fraction of a second. But there were a number of disadvantages, and these disadvantages keep rearing themselves with every problem that I've dealt with. The first, and maybe the most impactful, is the lack of extensibility. That means that if you have a slight change to the problem that you're tackling, then that neural network, for example, will not work anymore. You need to go back, collect more data, and retrain. Another problem is the curse of dimensionality. So let's say we want to make the neural network work for a broader class of problems, so we need to add another variable. Well, that addition of that variable will mean that the amount of data we need for training increases by an order of magnitude. So very quickly, it becomes impossible to do. There are other issues, such as there's a lack of guidance for designing neural networks and their black box devices. So there's limits on the confidence in the output. Can you tell me how much time I have left, please?
You are actually at time, Dr. Flood.
Okay. So, well, I'll stop there, but if I could just say one last thing to sort of round off, I can get to the next slide. So extensibility is the real issue, and I don't know if these slides will be made available later, but what I do here is analyze what we mean by extensibility, and it comes in three forms: the scope of the problem, the structure of the problem, and the precision of the problem. And there are tools out there that address these to an extent, like transfer learning, but they're very limited. And the emphasis of my research really is to increase, or has been in recent years, to increase the extensibility of the solutions that we develop. Okay, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to talk about some of my understanding of the AI-enabled urban planning. So I'm going to provide some framework. Next slide, please. So I can control it right here. So how do I control it? Okay. Well, AI is hot. Every time when I go to talk with the potential sponsors, and as soon as I mentioned, we're going to do something with AI, and the eyes brighten up. it is a good opportunity for us to demonstrate the value of AI technology, especially we have lots of sensing data and from different sources. So, but AI in planning or in the built environment, it's so vague, so huge, and it's hard to understand what it means. So I break down this phrase into 4 phases, so that we can understand it phase by phase. So I'll break down into AI assisted, AI augmented, AI automated, and autonomous. So I want to go through the slides and explain what it is and use some examples to show some of our work. So AI assistant means that we use AI as a tool to assist our work. See, for example, we can use AI, big data to rapidly identify problems, when, where, and why, those different issues. And then that will provide some data and tools for the planners to propose some solutions. So that is AI assistant. Of course, we have been doing this for a long time. This is one example that we just finished it, published this year. So basically what we're trying to do here is using the tweet data, identify the situation awareness to disasters. So in the disaster, before disaster, and during disaster, and after disaster, people using Twitters to express, to tell their friends what happened and what could happen and what they're doing. So what we're doing here is using the machine learning tools to identify different neighborhoods with different social demographic characteristics, and to see how different kind of people respond to this situation, disasters. And what we found is actually very interesting is that the poor neighborhood, excluding blacks, they appears to be more vulnerable. They're not as much as aware of what's happening, with compared to the black neighborhood, they're very active in Twitters. So they are pretty much know what's going on and asking for help from each other. So this is something that traditional methods cannot reveal. And this AI tools with the tweet data can actually provide more information for us. Another example, we also just finished it. This is a disaster, quickly identify the damage from a disaster. So previously, after the damage assessment is by human. So the assessor has go to the site and identify what's the damage. It's a time-consuming, labor-intensive task. So we, my student and develop some tools can quickly and almost in real time identify the damage from the Google Street View. And we also compare our results with the human assessment. So the accuracy is about more than 70% at this point, which is pretty good comparing to the traditional way of doing it. Because in our methods, it takes a few seconds to do it. With the traditional way, you have to go to the field and it takes a longer time. So the second phase is augment. Now the first phase is basically the AI provided tools to provide the data and to help us to identify the problems. Now the second phase is augmented. It's like an AI can help us to not only know what happened, it can help us to forecast what will happen. This is, we just recently got a grant from Microsoft. It's called AI for Earth grant. Basically, what we're trying to do here is to trained data. We have millions of data for the past disasters. See what people are doing and how do they travel, and in the evacuation, where do they go, and things like that. So we're trying to use the AI to train the data to find the patterns in different kind of disasters, and then using that training result to forecast for the future. So when the new disaster comes in, new hurricane comes in, pretty much we can forecast, where people are moving to, and what is the potential problems, and so on and so forth. This is another examples that we used AI to augment our understanding of how people adapt to storms and adapt to climate change or sea level rise. So here we look into the interactions between the government policy, the insurance policy, as well as residents' adaptation behaviors. So we could use that. We use that to simulate different scenarios. Like one scenario is what if the government build seawalls? Okay, and the second is what if the government provides some subsidy for help the low income family to purchase flood insurance, and so for the government, that's some of the options. And then for insurance, is also the different options, like the market-based insurance, government subsidized insurance, and then look at the behaviors of the residents. The behavior could be elevate my house, move away, or I didn't do anything. So we try to see what if one policy changes, what's the impact on the insurance company, what's the impact on behavior, and then identify which one is the most optimal ones. So we found that's very interesting from this study using the agent-based model plus AI, is that if you build a seawall, actually in the long run, it's not cost efficient. It's actually give this false sense of security to the residents, because residents don't do any self adaptation. So it's actually bad for adaptation in the long run. But this one, people will say, well, I don't need the AI to do that. Actually, for the AI, it helps you to quantify different thresholds. Like in terms of, we can quantify the insurance rate. This is another study we just finished. This is look at we look at the last 25 years of disaster data in Florida. We look at the weather information. We look at all the traffic counts and travel volume, travel behaviors data in Florida. The basic question is, we wanted to see before, during, and after the disaster, hurricane comes, how the people travel on the freeways. And also we want to find out what kind of network structure is more resilient to hurricanes. And then once we know that, we learn how do we build a future network, transportation network, so that it can be more resilient to disasters, especially hurricanes. So it's very interesting.
You are almost at time.
Okay, sorry. Quick. So the third phase is AI automatic. So basically, here is the planners give them a planning goal, and the machine will run itself, come out the results. So we also did some. This is one example that we recently doing. This is in downtown Tampa. We have all the Uber data, Uber-like data to origin destination, and then we said, what if we turn that into a fixed transit route? So then we use AI to automatically to say tell the planning goals, and then it automatically come out with the fixed route. And we compare that with the human designed route, it's actually better. This is another example using the bicycles, automatically do the bicycle route, design the bicycle route. So in the end, this autonomous, so the automated AI automated phase is still you need to the humans give the system goals and objectives. With autonomous, it can think like a human brain. So this one, we're not there yet, but we need to have a strong AI. Currently, we have a weak AI. With strong AI in the future, or like a human brain can think. Now, this is a challenge, this last slide. So we have some challenge. One is we have limited training data in the past, and then we have limited expertise in AI, especially in urban planning. So what are we gonna do? This is one reason that the URP has proposed have an urban analytics master program and
Dr.
a graduate
Peng?
certificate.
Dr. Peng, we're going to move on to Dr. Srinivasan now, but you can absolutely expand when we go to comments and questions. Thank you for your research.
All right, thank you.
Ravi, your microphone is not on.
Yes.
There you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, all good.
All right. So my name is Ravi Srinivasan. I'm a faculty at the Rinker School of Construction Management. I do have a word to Dr. Flood. His instant pot, noodle pot example is actually, I'm not able to get out of my head, and I'm actually hungry now. So at some point I'll kind of sit with you and kind of learn more about that. Okay, so I'm here to talk about the AI applications, especially the built environment. And as most of you may know, that my expertise is more towards building energy and focusing on more on the buildings, airflow, and so on and so forth. So I'll kind of spend some time going through talking about some of the work what we have done. I do have just 10 minutes. Okay, Avery, next. Thanks. Okay, so I'm going to talk in terms of two different levels. One is in an individual building level, and the second one is an urban scale. When we talk about individual building levels, I'm also going to kind of discuss about some of the work what we have done, especially in the building energy use, basically predicting the building energy use consumption over a period of, let's say, 1 year, or even looking at even further, like 20 years, 30 years, or 40 years from now, owing to climate change. The second thing, we have done work in occupant behavior. Dr. Zhong-Ren Peng talked about agent-based modeling. We have done this work, significant work. If you go back and look at some literature, you'll find that occupant behavior is one of the most important component of building energy and pretty much overlooked. So we've kind of embarked on that. We have published extensively on that as well. The other work I'm going to talk about with single buildings or individual buildings is about airflow. So pretty much, how do we run CFD? Dr. Fred talked about CFD in the BLAST project. So we are focusing on not using CFD, but understanding the kind of, the movement of, the air into the room, and how we kind of potentially kind of run some CFD simulations using AI. The next one is about optical location of vents. This is kind of a very interesting topic where we use genetic algorithms, very similar to what Dr. Zhong-Ren kind of, talked about. In terms of urban scale, I will again embark on a topic which is again focusing on different campuses. Using the Florida campus, Yukon campus, as well as the city of Gainesville. We're talking about not 1 or 2 buildings or 100 buildings, we're talking about 42,000 buildings. And then very recently, we secured NSF grant as a planning grant, and we're focusing on 2 interesting things. One is the lowest floor elevation. Again, going back to some of this is kind of very related to what Dr. Zhong-Ren Peng talked about. in terms of flood risk. We're doing something very similar here. Maybe we need to get him on board for the full proposal. And we're also focusing on envelope energy leakages. Next, please. So I want to kind of, give you the larger framework of where all of my research kind of sits in the perspective of the machine learning. So we have supervised and unsupervised. Within supervised, we do have regression and classification. And then unsupervised here, we have clustering, and we also have reinforcement learning. If you look at regression, I've kind of pinpointed specific domains of our work, what we have placed. I don't want to go through everything in detail. If you go to the next slide, I'll talk about something a little bit more. The reason why I want to show this slide is I want to kind of bring all of my students and all of the work what I've done in a previous life, as well as in some of the research proposals which are already out and under review. So it's kind of easy for us to understand. One thing for which I don't have a slide is the one which you see here. It's actually the NIH R21. It's kind of in the violet color. It's under review. For this, what we do is we use in the past, we've actually used genetic algorithms. This paper was published in 2004 when I was a student at Penn. We use genetic algorithm to identify the optimal location of the supply and return vent. So basically, we are taking something similar what I've done previously for identifying the optimal location for such vents inside an airborne infection isolation rooms in operation theaters. The problem here is COVID, right? So COVID, we need to kind of have a free-flowing movement of air. And then the problem here is actually the obstruction. The obstructions could be the humans, the doctors, the nurses, the bed, and so on and so forth. So what we want to do is we want to use kind of a dynamic ventilation system that we kind of move around depending on the way how people move around and the equipments are there, so that we can actually smoothly get all of these viruses out of this air room. The other one, which is also valid, you see at the bottom, is actually the NSF CBET proposal. We did submit earlier, and then it's under, we were given some additional comments working on that. And for that, we're actually using spectral clustering. Here, we're focusing on multiple different neighborhoods within the universe, within Gainesville, and then seeing how we can actually go much beyond simple k-means and use the time series data to kind of run some spectral clustering. There are a few other things. The one at the bottom is, which is in brown color. It's a work which I've done at Penn. I've done two work. One is the genetic algorithms for optimal location of supply and return ducts. The second one is actually to do with reinforcement learning, which I'll show in a minute. The ones that are highlighted in yellow or light orange are those ones that are currently being in progress right now with my students, as well as based on the NSF project. Next, please. So this is the work I was talking about at Penn. This is again kind of bypassing all the complex CFD simulations because it takes lots of time. So the question is, if I'm actually using a virtual reality or augmented reality system with a cyber glove, walk into the room, should I run a CFD simulation, kind of, for example, the Fluent software, the Fluent, or should I kind of completely move away from that and then use some kind of a potentially a real-time adverse simulation using AI? So that was the test which was done. And what you see on the right side is one of the journals. Next, please. And some of the work what you're going to see in the next few slides are the work done by my students. Most of them actually graduated here. In this case, what we have done is we have actually developed ensemble models for building energy prediction. This is again for individual building. If you look at regression models, the problems with regression models sometimes is the accuracy. I mean, you won't be able to get a good accuracy, but what we could do is potentially we could actually use ensemble models, which would kind of divide the data into multiple subsets, and then we could have multiple regression trees, and then we would be able to improve the model. We have published extensively, and then on the right side, you see the screenshot from the publication, which is from Energy in Buildings. That is a gold standard for building energy simulation work. Next, please. The next slide pretty much talks about all of the publications related to the ensemble models which we have done. Next, please. So this is the agent-based modeling, for which we used, we wanted to kind of solve the problem of occupant behavior. As I told you earlier, one of the biggest drawback in building energy simulation is it takes occupant numbers, number of people sitting in the room, not the behavior. The meaning of behavior here is the kind of interaction that I do with the environment. For example, opening or closing the door, opening or closing the windows. What about the change in the environment? What I could do as a person. So what we've done here is we've literally used an agent-based modeling technique, and then we use the building controls virtual test bed from the Lawrence Berkeley lab. So basically, we are kind of connecting the ABM model, which is coming from the PMF stuff from Penn, and then we use that with the Energy Plus. So basically, if you look at this diagram here, the Energy Plus outputs the internal conditions every hour, and then that goes to the agent-based model. There is one significant difference here in this particular agent-based model. It is not a simple rule set, otherwise things would be easy. But what happens is it does have another social component built within that. It has the goals, standards, and preferences of the agent. For example, if it's Ravi, then I do have certain goals, sustainability and whatnot, right? So we could actually add those as part of the agent-based modeling, and then the highest utility would be used as an outcome, not just based on rule sets. Again, on the right side, you see the publication from Energy Buildings. We have published extensively on this as well. Next, please. And the next slide shows all the different publications we've done. Next, please. This is about campus energy modeling. This is again focusing on energy consumption of the UF campus, not for the next year, but for 2041, 2057, and 2063. This was one of the PhD work which we have done. We have used ARIMA model for time series as well as long short-term memory. We have also published extensively on this one. Next, please. Yeah, and we have also published a literature review in renewable and sustainable energy reviews, which is again a very kind of a gold standard for energy reviews, which is part of Elsevier. Next, please. This is one of the recent work which we're working on. A couple of years ago, I received an award from the UF City of Gainesville, focusing on modeling the entire city of Gainesville using physics-based models. We ran 445,000 Energy Plus simulations in the Hypergator. But the problem here is we can't use Hypergator every time. So the question is, can we develop some kind of a technique so that we can completely use a data-driven methodology? So one of my my current student, Hei Kyung Yim, is working on that. As a matter of fact, yesterday I learned that she won the 3rd place in the poster. So congrats, Hei Kyung. Next, please. And as I told you, it is not just a modeling problem. The problem is actual implementation in the actual field, and that's a huge obstacle here, at least in the field of building and simulation. We have submitted a paper publication to the renewable and sustainable energy reviews. We're waiting for acceptance. We have pretty much captured all of the issues what we're facing right now, and so that we can be implemented widely. Next, please. The next few slides are actual work from the NSF grant. This is the NSF grant which we received, which is NSF as a PI. Here we are using acoustical sensors, basically cell phones, as I see on the picture on the right side. The cell phones were placed inside Hahn Museum. The cell phones gather the data, which is nothing but the audio signals. We remove the human voice for privacy, and then we process everything. So we do a lot of different classification. And as you see in this particular grant, the spectrogram right here, you will see that each of those specific signal that's being emanated could be assigned to a pump or an equipment. Essentially, what it means is, if I can listen to these individual tones or specific sound signature, I'll be able to kind of determine when those systems are going to fail. So next, please. So we have done extensive literature. We do have the software available in GitHub if you're interested to download. Next. This is the last project which I want to talk about, very relevant to what Dr. Zhong-Ren Peng talked about. Right now, the work is actually going on. This is the lowest floor elevation. Basically, if we need to send a surveyor to the site to determine the LFEs, it's going to cost money, it's going to cost time. What we have done is we have kind of developed a system where we fly the drone. The drone has dual cameras. One is a regular image, and the one is an IRT. So we use the IRT and the dual image to kind of process the foundation type and then determine the LFE. Interestingly,
Professor, you're at time. If you could wrap it up for me, please.
Yeah, less than a minute, everybody. Thanks. Next slide, please. So what we've done is, the previous research, people have actually used Google Street Images to determine the LFEs, and they found they were pretty much close to the actual within, let's say, 6 inches. Our current research, where we experimented with some of these buildings within the UF Energy Park, our error is close to 1/2 inch or 1 inch. So pretty much, we're getting there. Interestingly, last night I presented, my team presented this paper at a conference, and we won the best paper award also. Next slide, please. So one thing which I want to talk about is, this is actually one of the proposals which we submitted to the UFAI. The team includes myself, Dr. Flood, Jose Fortes, Bill Odell, Andrea, and so on and so forth. Jason is there, Stephen Bender is there. Okay, so yeah, so we focus not only on LFEs, but since we do have the IoT images, the question is, can we go reverse engineer to get the envelope energy wastages? Pretty much fly the drone, get LFEs at 100th of the time and the cost of a typical surveyor, as well as on the side, you also get the envelope energy leakages, which should be used by the county officials. Next slide, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ravi. We appreciate it.
Welcome.
Hi, everybody. This is a wonderful opportunity, so I'm so grateful to be here to share a small vignette with you about our research team's new work at the intersection of landscape interpretation, decision-making, households, and land use. At the core, our research group studies coupled natural and human systems dynamics, specifically attempting to link local decision-making across landscape scale geographies through space and time, while these landscapes are under the influence of intensification, urbanization, population growth and pressure, and even population decline. The point is here, though, I don't intend to cover all of our work and their diverse geographies. I really want to target some specific examples as related to our current efforts, and in reality, try to open up the ideas to talk about our research needs using experimental and probabilistic modeling, relying on machine learning. Before I jump in, I'd like to acknowledge all of our partners and collaborators that stretch across 3 countries, multiple federal agencies, and corporate partnerships for technology development. None of this work would have been possible without any single individual. Acknowledging their support, I'd also like to briefly introduce what this presentation doesn't include. Importantly, there's a critical research infrastructure need for us to advance the use of AI and machine learning in our work. The work I present today is experimental and exploratory. Unfortunately, we need targeted funding to pursue and develop tested AI tools for landscape interpretation, design, and planning. AI research has advanced outside of the humanities and social sciences, but targeted funding for research teams like ours is critical so that we can adopt, develop, and apply advanced tools in our work. So while the work I discussed today is funded through agencies like NASA and NSF, search agencies, it is not funding to support AI, machine learning, or tool development / validation. We carry this burden on our own. AI research initiatives tend to operate outside of the social sciences, developing sophisticated tools, but addressing unsophisticated social science questions. My hope is that the development of AI at our university will build that bridge so that we can build these tools from within our research team, not cobble tools from the outside. I could have chosen a number of AI-related topics to discuss today from our work. For example, we're using UAV, plane, and spaceborne LiDAR hyperspectral sensors in our work, so we could talk about the image processing. But I won't be talking about that today because if you go to the next slide, I really want to introduce our efforts that are somewhat foundational questions in planning and design, similar to what Zhong-Ren was talking about through the lens, though, in this case, of geodesign. When we talk about geodesign, we must explicitly reference Carl Steinetz's framework, which is shown here, and I admire Carl's work and appreciate the significant effort allied researchers are tackling landscape scale design and planning through this framework. Could you hit the next slide? For our team and my work, I've been focused on developing probabilistic tools and methods to integrate within this framework, and to do that so it is not so focused on top-down models. I reference our work as exploratory design and planning. It's a terrible name, but it addresses some of the challenges we face, attempting to integrate spatially and temporally explicit probabilistic models in landscape and land use planning. And I think this is something that Emery brought up in his talk earlier today. We just don't have the tools. For those that are familiar with Paul Zwick's Lucis model, I'd like to think that our work is laying some groundwork to integrate probabilistic models through machine learning into decision-making tools like Lucis. But these are early days. Next slide. To introduce the specific tool we are using, I will rely on 2 examples from our recent work and a specific approach to modeling called maximum entropy. This is, again, just one small example of what we're trying to do. I want to describe how we employed MaxEnt to investigate landscape scale planning and design in the context of new energy and fracking. Recently in the news again, fracking has opened up new natural gas resources across the planet, but it comes with unique challenges that can't be fully managed by traditional approaches to environmental planning, such as top-down best management practices. So I should say at the core of our approach is tool development that is embedded in place and people. I'll give a shout out to my buddy Jason's earlier presentation. We want to build and derive understandings, models, and tools that build from communities, not delivering solutions to communities. So about 8 years ago, I embarked on a multi-year project to investigate probabilistic tools to do just this fact and explore this phenomena in the context of this energy resource. Next slide. So to do this, we relied on data and information from Pennsylvania to better understand, interpret, project, and visualize change across this geography. Here showing some of our early models in the underlying Marcellus shale deposit. If you're not familiar with it, it's a very deep deposit that has been targeted for fracking across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and New York. Next slide. Building on work by the Nature Conservancy, we adapted and adopted a maximum entropy approach as an effort to capture the present and future of the decisions and landscape changes facing communities. Simply, fracking isn't just drilling a hole in the ground and sucking out the gas. It's associated with massive landscape and community transformation from anywhere from increased traffic, new roads, deforestation, erosion, and water management. We viewed these challenges as niche-based challenges, which is why we selected the maximum entropy approach. MaxN is a software based on the maximum entropy approach, which produces a model distribution based on a set of environmental layers and geographic coordinates of occurrences or observations. As a niche-based approach, maximum entropy not only provides an approximation of the factors that contribute to the distribution, but also a framework to discuss what environmental, spatial, and temporal factors contribute to that distribution. Next slide, please. So in this case, can you get the next slide? Next slide. Hey, so we relied on 20 variables when we produced this spatially explicit, temporally sensitive map for the future probabilities of landscape change across Pennsylvania. And these were our first order models, which gave us a kind of a spatial canvas to work with. Next slide, please. And then those modeling results were brought into to develop second order models that simulated all of the adjacent changes, such as roads, pipelines, and this one's showing pipelines under various local, state, and federal regulatory scenarios. Simply, we programmed those and got the gas to our theoretical market as shown in this slide. Next slide. This was just our first effort, right? But it proved very important for a variety of reasons, including allowing us to confront the sum total consequences of incremental decisions on a landscape. It allowed us to look at second order questions that are derived from large planning decisions, looking at the intersections of conflicting landscape values, again, thinking about how Lucis might work in this system, reconnecting environmental feedback mechanisms to our study by actually studying the place-based systems and decision-making, but perhaps most importantly, engaging communities of people. And this is exactly what we're aiming to do in our recent work across the southern lowlands of Mexico. Only now we are not relying on a mega exogenous factor like fracking. Here our interest in documenting, understanding, and projecting population growth and pressure and intensification of land use. We not only wanted to study how households invested in landscapes across a giant geography, but start to chart out some of the positive scenarios for future change. Could you hit the next slide? If you see me present, this got started about 4 years ago, just a few months after I joined the UF, or before I joined the UF faculty, when we acquired and repurposed airborne LiDAR used to measure and model above ground carbon stocks. Next slide. One of the unique aspects of these data is that they recovered areas that are generally considered natural landscapes across the southern lowlands of Mexico. These areas are increasingly under pressure for landscape change, but also are considered largely underdeveloped. Next slide. We developed a series of research questions associated with this. This goes back to Dr. Flood's presentation. I mean, this is embedded within our scientific inquiry. Let's go to the next slide so I can talk about the process. And again, this goes back to what Dr. Flood was talking about. We have it embedded within our process. So in this case, AI is kind of one cog in our tool. Let me show you what the results, go to the next slide, of our processing look like. We'll do one more slide to keep on time. What we're finding in these samples, and the results were just published by Whit Schroeder, a Fiber postdoc, we're finding thousands of households, features, changes to the landscape that were previously undocumented in our samples across the lowlands. As a matter of fact, we have something like 65,000 structures and households that have been documented in this region. Go to the next slide. Using MaxN, we're comparing these positive occurrences or these observations against dozens of variables, including soil, climate, and physiography. Go to the next slide. So we're using things like mean annual precipitation, physiographic region. Go to the next slide. You can see that there is visually some correlation there, but to truly understand the relationship, MaxN allows us to develop these models. And currently we have 54 variables under test. Go ahead to the next slide, sorry. This first set of models, I think we use something like 21 variables to look at the distribution. The purple dots are the positive occurrences across our sample areas. And this shows the probabilistic distribution of structures under these 22 variables. But if you go to the next slide, we realized quickly that we had to do some spatial autocorrelation and figure out some of these variables are already related. So if you hit the next slide, it caused us to develop a hierarchical modeling approach to what we were doing. So instead of relying on as many variables as possible, we're reducing the number of variables by first investigating their spatial autocorrelation, and second, by developing a hierarchical theme. Go to the next slide. So we developed 2 test models. Another thing we found out is 65,000 observations, entirely too many observations to put into our maximum entropy model. So we had to develop a spatially rarefied sample to compare against. These are all kind of the nuts and bolts of the modeling. Hit the next slide. But what we've got now is a really solid understanding of what the distribution or what factors may be influencing the distribution of houses and households across these southern lowlands in Mexico. This shows how the model compares to each other, and then on the bottom set, how each variable contributes to our overall distribution. But let's go to the next slide, and so I can wrap things up. You know, we talk about the use of AI in our work, but I hoped to actually contribute to this discussion by saying that these models are you know, they're going to be done in a couple of weeks, and we'll be sending the manuscript out for review. But the core aim in all of this is using these models to get into the field and talk to communities and to validate the sorts of things that we're seeing across very large landscape scale geographies, with the aim and purpose of not necessarily coming in and making decisions from the top down, but taking this information, providing it to those who are making the decision on a daily basis, that is households and communities, and informing those second sets of subsequent decisions of landscape change. So thanks a lot for this opportunity. I look forward to any questions you all might have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Murtha. We have time for questions and answers. I do have one question in the chat so far for Dr. Peng. Dr. Peng, does AI application consist of learning about the whole process to reach optimized results in multiple iterations?
Yes, of course. It takes a long time actually to run based on the power of the computing. So sometimes take anywhere from 2 to 6 hours to run the whole data sets. Yes.
Hey, Dr. Flood, we have a question for you regarding the advantages or the disadvantages of AI techniques. Are there hybrid models used to calibrate and elevate confidence in the results? Example, using refer CFD simulations to suggest outcome directions.
Okay. So I understood the question to be, are there tools available to help in the validation process? Is that correct?
Yes, are there hybrid models used to calibrate and elevate confidence in the results regarding the disadvantages of AI techniques?
Okay, so that really comes down to validation. There's many techniques that you can use to validate a model. I mean, the typical one is you keep a set portion of the data aside and not use it to develop the model, and then you use that data then to evaluate it afterwards. You have to be very careful when you do that, though, to make sure that that data set used for validation is representative of the whole problem. And you might find that on average, the model works well, but there might be regions where it doesn't work appropriately. So yes, there are, and there are other subtle techniques where you can come in and evaluate the relevance or significance of various inputs to the model and rank them accordingly and remove the ones that are not so important. That sort of simplifies the model somewhat and can sometimes enable further improvement of the model. But I had actually listed 4 major issues. Extensibility is one. The validation problem is more to do with the black box issue. And then the other 2 were how to design a network, because there's very little guidance on selecting an appropriate architecture. And the other was the total amount of data. But all of those all of those issues are actually interrelated. If you can solve one, you come some way to resolving the others. But yes, there are standard methods available for validation. Another type of validation, though, associated with the black box nature of neural networks, there are tools that are being developed. It's called extensible AI, where you can sort of inquire as to why is the neural network giving me this solution, proposing this solution. And that is supposed to add confidence too. And it is particularly important if you're dealing with problems where ethics might be an issue. Like if you're making banknotes, for example, that they're not, they don't have some inherent racial prejudice in the conclusions that are being drawn. I don't know if that answers the question. That's hopefully.
Thank you, Dr. Flood. I am going to hand it over to Dr. Portillo, who has a few questions.
Okay. We're going to be finishing this session. I would like to hear from Tim, first of all, and then pass the mic, so to speak, to Ravi. How, with UF having potentially this opportunity to move into a leadership position on AI and knowing the niche that UF is seeking is that AI will permeate across campus, across the 100 majors that we have here at UF, and will be a disappointment if it does not do that. Tim, I'd like you, because you not only are a faculty member in landscape architecture, in FIBER, the Florida Institute for Resiliency in Environmental Resiliency, as well as hold an appointment in Latin American Studies. What do you think about UF's potential promise in this space? And how do you think that could transform the fields you're working in and the campus?
Well, I don't want to take up too much time because I could talk for hours about this, Meg. Thanks for the question. I mean, I think it comes down to, and especially as a trained anthropologist, I think about the way things are organized influences the outcome a lot. And sometimes we don't think about that as much as we think about the technology development. And so what I see as the promise here, as opposed to where it might be in other places, is once this initial set of hires comes through and there is an AI foundation, maybe through computer science and engineering, that you can kind of release some of the energy to some of the more exploratory areas that just don't, I mean, our funding agencies aren't going to support the tool development. And so to have that opportunity, I think, is the real unique thing that UF has this capacity to do now. It's to not just kind of build an AI that serves these other disciplines, but to actually bring the technology into the research groups and allow them to come back to the foundational AI support and say, no, don't do what you're doing, do what we need you to do. And I think that will be transformative, at least with the social sciences and humanities, because we have such wicked, complex problems to address. The more we can kind of assemble a model that and try to give it to somebody to break, the better off we're going to be. So that'd be my first gut reaction.
And it allows a little risk taking, and that's exactly where creativity and innovation can occur.
I love risk, so I think you're right about that. Lots of risk.
So let's hear from Ravi.
Yes, I do agree with him. And one of the things which I learned from this research symposium is the kind of, the swath of different diverse faculty, but, they kind of experience what they do, the kind of work what they do, especially in AI. So one thing what we have to do is to kind of really understand and see whether we can collaborate. I never knew that some of the faculty like Hassan or Emre, they have been working on AI, right? So something which we need to kind of bring together. There are so many different issues which we have to face. One other thing which I always think about is the creativity and the novelty actually happens at the intersection of disciplines. So if we can actually bring or come together to kind of understand and see how we can actually help each other, I think we would be well ahead of any of the other universities or the colleges of the department.
That's fantastic. So Zhong-Ren and Ian, anything you want to add to what Tim and Ravi had to say?
Yeah, I think the college really have a critical role to play in the university's AI initiative. And by listening to all this presentation, we already have been doing AI-related work. But we needed to have a structure and especially not only like physical structure that allow us to use AI, but also a structure in place that the organization structure in place that support this kind of research, especially collaborative research. Especially when you apply for a big grant right now, if you're all faculty come from the same college, it's very difficult to get it. So in other words, we need to set up some mechanism in the future, maybe for the college to think about how do we get engaged more actively with other colleagues in the university.
Right. I mean, that's what the moonshot proposals were all about. And so how do we build that infrastructure rather than trying to scramble, right when the call comes out? Absolutely.
Right.
Well,
yeah, you can play a very critical role here to bridge the faculty from different college, that we can sit down in the table and talk about some similar issues.
And we also have our the ability to collaborate with industry and practice in a way that can leverage us
yes,
as well. So Ian, any other final words before we wrap up the session?
I agree with what Ravi said. The difficult part is the intersection between the problem and the solutions that we have. So it's, maybe the people in computer science developing the algorithms on the one side, and then people like us on the other side with the real problems that need solving. But sort of matching one against the other, that interface, that's where the real skill, that's where the real art of AI exists. And so this is something that I've been saying at the university level AI working group. They look at either one extreme or the other, and there's very little looking at that interface. So I think we need to be concentrated more on that interface and developing the skills there. That's the only way we're going to get the fantastic algorithms, but to get them to work in the real world, that's the only way we're going to be able to do it.
Well, it's a challenge, but there certainly is the creativity and the ability to take risks. And I so appreciate what each one of you brought to this panel. I think you're doing very important work in this space. So thank you very much for contributing.